And joining us now on the debate for the full hour tonight, in Chicago, Illinois, John Mearsheimer, professor of political science at the University of Chicago and co-author of The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy. In Washington, D.C., David Frum, editor of the Frum Forum and former speechwriter for President George W. Bush. And Peter Beinart, professor of journalism and political science at the City University of New York and author of The Icarus Syndrome. And here in studio in Toronto, Derek Penzler, professor of Jewish history at the University of Toronto. A reminder, we call these our Thursday broadcasts Your Agenda, because you are part of the discussion. You can reach us via Twitter at twitter.com/theagenda or by email at theagenda@tvo.org. Throughout the broadcast, we'll put your comments on the screen. And our fifth column blogger, Mike Miner, is hosting a live chat on our Inside Agenda producers blog at tvo.org/theagenda. So please jump in, join the debate in whichever way you prefer. Derek, nice to see you again. Good to have our guests along the line in Points Beyond in the United States. I want to start by just having each of you, very briefly if I could, give us your understanding of what you think happened on Monday. Start the story where you want, put the emphasis wherever you want. And by doing so, I think our viewers will get a sense of where you're all coming from in this debate. David Frum, why don't you start us off?
Well, as you know, the Hamas terrorist organization took over control of Gaza and acted as the effective government of that territory. From the moment it did so, it began to fire rockets into Israeli territory. It kidnapped an Israeli soldier, and that triggered a armed conflict at the end of 2008. That armed conflict was ended, but it was ended inconclusively, with Hamas still holding the Israeli soldier, among other things, and Israel then imposed a blockade. The flotilla was an attempt to run the blockade. There had been previous attempts like that, and all of them had ended peacefully when the blockade runners agreed to dock at an Israeli port, submit to a security inspection, make sure they weren't carrying weapons or other contraband. That is what looks like it's going to happen with the next vessel in the flotilla, the Rachel Corrie, an Irish-supported ship. In this case, however, the flotilla did not heave to, or rather, one of the ships in the flotilla did not heave to. Israeli troops boarded that vessel armed with non-lethal weapons. They walked into a fight. They got beat up, and they began firing live ammunition. People were killed. It's unfortunate, but it was also something where the people on the boat knew they were running into a very hazardous situation. They were deliberately provoking armed force, and they took a terrible risk, and the results were terrible.
John Mearsheimer, give us your sense of the events.
Well, first of all, when you think about the blockade of Gaza, it's important to realize that almost everybody outside of Israel believes that this is collective punishment and it is a violation of international law, and that therefore that the blockade is wrong. Now, what this flotilla was trying to do was engage in a form of civil disobedience. There's no question about it. They think that the blockade is illegal, and they were trying to run the blockade in a very overt fashion. The Israelis made a huge mistake, first of all, in attempting to board the ships in international waters, because that's a clear violation of international law and is going to do nothing but get them into trouble. They were very foolish to not wait until those ships were outside of international waters. Secondly, they made the mistake of using military forces to try to occupy the ships in international waters. And they were armed, and not surprisingly, on one of the ships, the people fought back, and they had every right to fight back. And the end result is that 9 people died, many people were wounded, and Israel ended up with a huge black eye. And I would say, from reading the Israeli press, almost everybody in Israel believes that this was a botched operation, and Israel not only did enormous damage to itself, but it's also throwing into question the whole matter of whether Israel is a strategic asset for the United States. So I think this was a disaster for Israel, and one that they should have had the common sense to see coming and figured out a different way to deal with this problem.
Okay, Derek Penzler, your view.
Well, I think where you start a story depends, or helps determine where you end it. I'm going to start 6 months ago, something that hasn't come up at all, when the Israelis seized a ship 160 kilometers off the coast of Gaza on the high seas in international waters. It was a ship carrying 200 tons of weapons, most likely from Iran, to Gaza. Now that happened, and the international community made a kind of a brief squawk, but the whole thing blew over. And I think there's a mentality in Israel that just as they were allowed to do that, because they felt that if these weapons got to Gaza, they'd fall into the hands of Hamas and be used against Israel, they have a right to maintain this blockade. They had a right to board this ship. And there is this sense in Israel of a sense that they, although the operation was incorrectly implemented and planned, that they basically had a right to do this. The international community, by and large, seems to disagree.
Peter Beinart.
Let me start at earlier on than everybody. In January 2006, Israel, after dismantling settlements in Gaza, decided to hold an election. It decided to hold an election in which Hamas was allowed to run. Hamas won that election. Hamas was interested in going into some kind of Palestinian national unity government. There were problems between Fatah and Hamas, but the United States and Israel both adamantly objected to a Palestinian national unity government. In fact, according to, I think, credible reports, the U.S. actually tried to get elements in Fatah to militarily take power in Gaza and kick Hamas and overturn the results of that election. That is what led Hamas to militarily seize control in Gaza in the middle of 2007. Since then, you've had a blockade which is more than simply a blockade aimed at preventing weapons from getting through. I would have no problem with that kind of blockade. It is a form of collective punishment. When the economy of Gaza, Gazans are not allowed to export virtually anything. A whole long list of things, including chocolate and flowers, are not allowed into Gaza. The whole territory, although there are people not starving, has been made dependent on food aid. And this has not succeeded either in getting the release of Gilad Shalit, who should absolutely be released, the Israeli soldier, nor has it had the function of weakening Hamas, which was the idea of the whole plan. So this was the context in which Israel was put into this no-win situation of trying to defend a blockade, this kind of blockade, which it should not be defending.
Okay, not surprisingly, we have four fairly different versions of relatively the same event. I'd like to go once more around the horn now. David, we'll start with you again. Tell us of the three versions that are not yours, whether you have any quibbles with any particular parts of them, and if so, what?
Well, I have some. I think we have an agreed upon set of facts. I don't think anybody disputes that the Israelis think that this operation went well. That's obviously right. It didn't go well. You should be able to do these things in a different way. On the other hand, I think people who are from the outside have to be very hesitant about criticizing those with the burden of responsibility. Not all military operations do go well. We have seen in Afghanistan, with troops from all of the coalition countries there, that things often go wrong, and often with much more tragic result. Hundreds of dead, and in those cases, often completely innocent people, not people who are assuming the risk of violently engaging an armed force. I think if you violently engage an armed force and you get hurt, your heirs don't have a lot of right to complain. I want to pick up on something that John Mearsheimer said about Israel being, yes or no, a strategic asset for the United States. I believe it is. I also think that's a strange way to evaluate the operations of other countries. I mean, when Germany accidentally injured and killed a lot of people in Afghanistan, we didn't start to debate the existence or the value of Germany. Normal countries, and Israel's a normal country, they exist as countries for their own people, for their own purposes.
John, you heard three other versions of the same events. What quibbles would you like to point out?
Well, let me just go back to David and the point that he raised about whether or not Israel is a strategic asset. I do agree with him that Israel is a normal country. And I think that as a normal country, it sometimes pursues foolish policies and it sometimes pursues smart policies. All countries fit that general description, including the United States. But because of our special relationship with the United States, we're in a position where we have to back Israel to the hilt no matter what it does. And the fact of the matter is that in recent years, the Israelis have pursued a number of boneheaded policies. They've gotten themselves into a whole heck of a lot of trouble. And at virtually every turn, we've backed them to the hilt because that's what the special relation calls for. Now, the reason that we have that special relationship is because pro-Israel forces in the United States make it almost impossible for any president to put pressure on Israel or to criticize Israel. What would be best for Israel at this point in time, especially with regard to the settlements, is if Barack Obama could put pressure on Israel. If Barack Obama could criticize Israel for its boneheaded policy with regard to this flotilla. But that's not possible. Instead, we back Israel to the hilt, and the end result of all this is that it's going to continue to pursue foolish policies to its detriment and to our detriment.
Okay, Derek, where do you differ with the three other versions of the events that you heard?
Well, I would disagree with what John was saying just now, because the special relationship does involve support for Israel. It doesn't necessarily involve complete, unrestricted support. I can think of many times in the last 30, 40 years when the American administration has not done what Israel wanted, but the special relationship was upheld.
Well, how about a month ago when Joe Biden visited and they announced the settlements the same day?
Well, that was an Israeli action that insulted the Americans, but I'm thinking the other way around. During the Yom Kippur War of 1973, the Israeli move on Cairo was stopped by pressure from President Nixon. The Israeli assault against West Beirut was stopped under the Reagan administration. During the first Persian Gulf War, the Israelis were told, don't attack Baghdad. Do not do it under any circumstances. And the Israelis had to give in. The fact is that time and time again, the relationship is tested. Until now, the relationship is held, not because the American White House simply has to do Israel's bidding, but because it's perceived, more often than not, that Israel's interests are identical with those of the United States. That's what's being challenged now.
Peter, where do you differ with the other three versions you just heard?
Well, I think the flotilla incident is not as important to me as the larger conversation about the embargo. I mean, I agree with David on 2 points. First, I think the people on that one particular ship seem to have been, they were clearly not nonviolent people. And the Israeli commandos found themselves in a very, very difficult situation. I hope Israel will do the kind of independent investigation, not a military investigation, but an independent investigation where they choose a Supreme Court justice, like they did in Winograd in 2006 and at the beginning of the Second Intifada, that is a kind of proud Israeli tradition. But the issue is really not the incident itself. It is the conditions that created that, and that's the blockade. And that's where I think you're just beginning to get some debate inside the United States about this question of whether this really is a blockade purely meant to prevent Hamas from getting rockets, or whether in fact it is a form of collective punishment to try to convince the Palestinians to turn against Hamas. That, I think, is morally wrong, and it's politically not working.
Well, let's follow up on that then. David, there are reports tonight that either a ship or perhaps even ships will try once again to push through that blockade and deliver something, medical supplies, we don't know exactly, but certainly at least medical supplies to Gaza. Next time this happens, how should Israel respond?
Well, we may be reading different reports, but what I read just before I came on the show was a report that indeed there had been a negotiation between the Irish government and the Israeli government, and that the one ship that we are talking about, the one ship that actually exists that departed Malta, will peacefully dock at Ashdod, will submit its goods to security inspection, and they will then be delivered to Gaza. And just to put that in some kind of context, it's important to understand that all of the ships in the flotilla, including the Marmara, which is a big ship, and the Rachel Corrie, the next ship, which is not so big, you add everything those ships were carrying, and that's less than 1 day's humanitarian relief, less than what arrives in Gaza every 24 hours anyway via Israel. So I think let's hope for more good sense on the part of future people. No one is in the way of humanitarian aid to Gaza if you comply with the rules. It is when this embargo is not about chocolate and it's not about flowers, as Peter said. This is about Hamas trying to pry open the embargo so as to get its hands on weapons, as are now flowing into Hezbollah. And I think in this case, that has been defeated. I think Hamas will find it difficult to find people willing to do this again. And this is, although Israel has suffered, obviously, a great blow here, I think Hamas is actually one of the biggest losers, because this attempt to pry open the embargo has failed. There may be others, but this one has failed. I don't think there will be other boats defying the Israeli Navy on the seas.
Peter, you want to come back on that?
Yeah, I mean, I disagree with that. First of all, if you look, Haaretz did a really remarkable investigation of the embargo last summer. And if you look at the reports that the Israeli human rights organization Gisha has managed to get out of the military, what you find is that this is a very arbitrary embargo, to some degree even a corrupt one in which, for instance, Israeli industrial and agricultural interests play a significant role in deciding what gets through or not, depending on whether they have surplus supply, and partly because they don't want the creation of industry in Gaza that would compete with them for the Gazan market. This is an arbitrary, to some degree corrupt policy that I think Israel has fallen into, much as it has with the settlement policy, without really thinking it through very effectively at the top. And I think there is going to be pressure in fact, even the New York Times reporting tonight that Netanyahu was talking about opening the embargo and allowing more humanitarian goods in. I think that's very important. You know, Gazan students are not even allowed to go to the West Bank to study, something that was denounced by 10 Israel Prize winners. So this embargo is very, very problematic. Maybe a narrower embargo could be acceptable, but over the long term, I think what we should be doing is trying to find a Palestinian national unity government that will commit itself to a ceasefire and be a partner for negotiation with Israel.
John, you wanted to add to that?
I just wanted to put this discussion into a broader context. I mean, even if Israel ends the blockade, which I hope it does, the problem of Gaza does not go away, and the problem of rockets being fired into Israel doesn't go away. There's no question about that, and there's no question that Israel has a right to defend itself.